Education aims to provide accessible, quality, and relevant basic education to every Filipino nationwide. To realize this vision, the DepEd launched Sulong Edukalidad, a campaign to improve the basic education system of the country by focusing on 4 priority areas: K-12 curriculum review and update, improvement of the learning environment, teacher upskilling and reskilling, and engagement of stakeholders for support and collaboration. As a contribution to the teacher upskilling and reskilling pillar, and in preparation for the next cycle of the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, the department presents you with a professional development program on Assessment and Emerging Literacies with focus on PISA. The Assessment PD program is a professional development program that aims to improve teachers' assessment literacy and content knowledge in order to develop reading, math, and science literacy of junior high school students. The program is jointly developed and delivered by DepEd's Office of the Secretary, Bureau of Education Assessment, Bureau of Learning Delivery, and the National Educators Academy of the Philippines accredited learning service providers, namely the Assessment Curriculum and Technology Research Center, Front Learners Incorporated, and Center for Educational Measurement. They are also joined by distinguished assessment experts and practitioners from the academe. The Assessment PD program brings together grade 8 and 9 English, Science, and Mathematics teachers in public junior high schools nationwide. Running from October 2021 to April 2022, the Assessment PD program has 5 component courses. The first course, on enhancement of teachers' assessment competencies, introduces teachers to assessment competencies based on national and international standards. Assessment of Learning in DepEd intends to help teachers familiarize themselves on DepEd policies, standards, and programs pertaining to classroom, national, and international assessments. The third course is on the Philippine K-12 curriculum and the ILSA, which provides participants an opportunity to compare local and international frameworks in reading, math, and science in order to understand emerging directions in teaching and assessment. Adapting assessment principles and practices to the emerging literacies provides participants with accessible tools, learning resources, and instructional strategies that will help them address literacy gaps identified by the PISA 2018 results. Lastly, the course on monitored application of assessment practice in the classroom setting is an avenue for synthesis and integration of learning through the practical demonstration of assessment competencies, principles, methods, and strategies. Filipino learners need to be equipped to face the increasingly complex challenges faced by the world today. Their preparation starts in the classroom, so we need to ensure that our teachers are given the tools and knowledge that they need to unlock their students' full potential. The Assessment PD is one step forward to this goal.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Grasya mo upang kami mapagmahal. Dapat na tagapagpangalaga ng kalikasan. Maluwalhati ka, Panginoon. Dakila sa lahat, O Panginoon. Napakabuti mo, kailan may hindi ka nagbabago, Panginoon.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Malik Yawmiddin. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. Ya Allah, kati ya Allah, papalad na miska ya Allah ya Rahman ya Rahim. Sa mga tawag ya wa ya Allah sigwagman ka ya Allah ya Rahman ya Rahim. Ya Allah bungi ya Allah sa mapya pamikiran ya Allah. Amo sarami ya Allah siku o kawapi siku kapugingad ya Allah pakangiginawa ya kami kay ya Allah pakapamagugupa kami kay ya Allah. So kalangulawan o Pilipino ya Allah sisagi nga Pilipinas ya Allah. Napakanadurugungan kaya sa mga mapya pamikiran ya Allah si kapugingad ya Allah. Ya Allah na argang kar kami ya Allah Rahman ya Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin.
Maluwalhati ka, Panginoon. Dakila sa lahat, O Panginoon. Napakabuti mo, kailanman hindi ka nagbabago, Panginoon.
Good morning, teachers. Welcome again to our third synchronous session for English teachers. I am Lalaine Baggy, a research officer of the Assessment, Curriculum and Technology Research Center, or ACTRC, and I will be one of your hosts for today. Good morning, Carissa.
Morning, Lalaine, and good morning, everyone. I'm Carissa Loberiza, also one of the research officers of ACTRC. I will also be one of your hosts today. We also want to acknowledge our attendees for today's synchronous session. Of course, we have with us the junior high school English teachers from different parts of the country. Congratulations for reaching the last synchronous session of Module 1B, Building Assessment Competence of Teachers.
Also with us are our partners from DepEd, especially the DepEd Assessment PD Secretariat. We would also like to take the opportunity to give our special thanks to DepEd, led by Secretary Lenore Briones and Undersecretary Nepomuceno Malaluan, the National Educators Academy of the Philippines, the Australian Government DFAT, University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, or CIDS, and the UP Integrated School. And now, before we proceed to the actual discussion, let's listen to a short message from the Australian Ambassador to the Philippines, His Excellency Stephen J. Robinson.
G'day to all of you, our fine teachers. It is a privilege to speak to you today and commend you for being part of this online professional development opportunity. Your work is so important to the future of your country because education is key. It is one of the foundations of society. And how well you educate children will have an impact on the future of this country. Australia has been involved with the education sector in the Philippines for several decades now because we want to see a strong, prosperous, educated Philippines. I am pleased that Australia supports DepEd on teacher professional development and curriculum enhancement through partners like Assessment, Curriculum and Technology Research Center, or ACTRC, an organisation born from Filipino-Australian collaboration and shared expertise. I hope you find this training delivered by ACTRC in collaboration with the Department of Education's National Educators Academy of the Philippines useful in further developing the reading, math and science literacy of your students. As you are aware, this training is part of a series of professional development activities on student learning assessments and emerging literacies. It is closely aligned with the focus of the Program for International Student Assessment, PISA, which the Philippines participated in for the first time in 2018. I am glad to note that this program aims to support you in responding to the evolving needs of your students for relevant and updated knowledge and skills, an area of particular interest to Australia. I would like to briefly acknowledge ACTRC, specialists from the University of the Philippines and the University of Melbourne. Education remains a core priority for Australia's development cooperation with the Philippines. Our partnership in education has gone from strength to strength over the last 3 decades. Australia and the Philippines are also long-standing partners. Last year, in 2021, we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the diplomatic relationship between Australia and the Philippines. On a personal level, let me share with you that supporting teachers is something very close to my heart. I was a teacher myself, and so were several of the staff members at the embassy before we pursued careers in diplomacy. So, I am intimately familiar with some of the challenges of your work and the importance of what you do. The pandemic has made your jobs much more challenging, and we appreciate your continued perseverance, innovation, and resilience in facilitating learning for millions of Filipino children across different modalities. Our children's education right now is one of the most important investments we have for the future. Education is a fundamental aspect of development, both to an individual and to a society. Australia, as a reliable friend and a good neighbour to the Philippines, will support you in whatever way we can. In closing, I would like to leave you with a line from Joseph Joubert. To teach is to learn twice. I hope you will not get tired of teaching, because that also means you will continue to learn. So thank you for your love of learning. I wish you all the very best as you continue with your quest for education quality through these trainings. Congratulations to all of you. Mabuhay.
Thank you, Ambassador Robinson. Lalaine, what can we expect from today's session?
Today, we will talk about the topics discussed in asynchronous sessions 5 and 6, the interpretation and use of student data between lessons, and evaluation of the assessment process.
That's right. We will have resource speakers to help us go through the highlights of sessions 5 and 6. I'm sure we are all excited to listen to them, but first, what will be the flow of the program today?
We will go by session, Carissa. First, we will have session 5. Our resource speaker will give the summary and highlights of session 5. After her presentation, she will address some of the questions raised by our teacher participants during the asynchronous session. We will have the same format for session 6. Then we will have an open forum at the end to answer some live questions that you will get from the YouTube comments. So teachers, if you have questions, please type in your questions in the YouTube comment section.
Thanks for that. Let us now proceed to session 5. Our speaker is ACTRC's Philippine Director since 2014. She is a professor of special education at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and the former dean of the College of Education. She is the chair of the Technical Committee for Special Education and a member of the technical panel on teacher education of the Commission of Higher Education. She is active in research on Philippine basic education with a focus on inclusion and persons with disabilities. Her recent roles in research on inclusive education include being the lead researcher of incorporating disability in the Conditional Cash Transfer Program and being project director of the Philippine Response to Indigenous Peoples and Muslim Education Program. Her other research interests are student achievement and deaf literacy. Let's all welcome Dr. Therese Bustos.
Okay, so good morning to all of you. Thank you for being part of this training program. And I hope that you have been learning a lot. So we've had 2 synchronous sessions. And so we hope that through the 2 synchronous sessions of the 2 previous weeks, plus today's session, you would have a better understanding of what assessment is and its role in education. So my role today is to summarize and to give you the highlights of session 5, and that is the session on interpretation and use of student data between lessons. So I will be going back to concepts that have been presented in the previous sessions. And so we're building up on those. Okay, so the objectives of this particular session, session 5, would be for us to be able to interpret and use hypothetical assessment data between lessons or day-to-day assessment cycles. I know you're familiar already with the assessment cycles. So we want to be able to use assessment interpretation to help learners progress to higher levels of development, as well as for us to be able to apply the 3 feedback questions and the 4 levels of feedback. You will find that these are lessons that we covered in the previous synchronous session. So, but we would like to reiterate these concepts as they are very important in teaching. And so we sought to answer 3 essential questions. And these are, how is basic interpretation of assessment data done between lessons or day-by-day assessment cycle? What are the uses of interpreted assessment data? And how is assessment data in particular, used to help learners progress to higher developmental levels? And then lastly, how is appropriate feedback crafted and provided to learners? So again, so let's just review what is interpretation. So we said last time that we collect assessment data. So we collect, results from different activities that we do in our classrooms, but we do not just collect. We need to interpret and use the information that we were able to collect. So interpretation, which is necessary to be able to use the information properly, interpretation means that we make sense of the evidence from assessments. So if a student got 8/10, what does that mean? If a student got 5/10, what does that mean? So it doesn't mean, or it's not just limited to passing or failing, because definitely the scores that our students get say a lot about the things that we need to do in our classes. And so the different uses of assessment interpretations include grading and reporting, as well as improving teaching and learning in our classes or even in remote, and providing feedback to our learners. So what I'm going to do is I'll go through each of these 3 uses of assessment interpretations. And so when we say that we will grade and report, the progress of students to parents, so that's an example of one use of assessment interpretation. So we use assessment interpretation to be able to grade and to be able to inform key stakeholders. PPST Strand 5.4 says that we teachers need to be able to communicate learners' needs, progress, as well as their achievement to key stakeholders. Now, key stakeholders would include their parents. It would include the students themselves, because they need to know where they are and where they where they are going, how they are progressing. We also do the same. We report to our principals, to our coordinators. We also report to the regional offices. And generally, we report to the central office. We need to be able to communicate our students' progress, not just to the student, but there's a bigger community that needs to know about those results. So again, so the purpose when we do grading and reporting, mainly is the focus rather is on long cycle assessments. For example, when we report performance during a quarter, so that's an example of a long cycle assessment. And so when we provide some feedback to parents, for example, in the report card, so that's an example, no? Also, we provide some feedback, especially when we move from one unit to another. We provide feedback to our students. And so even the grading, so we provide grades. We issue summative assessments around the end of a particular unit. So this now refers to like medium cycle assessments. So the purpose again of grading and reporting is more related to long cycle assessments as well as medium cycle assessments. So we also said that another use of assessment interpretation is when we want to improve the teaching and learning process. And so what do we mean by that? First, let's go to what the PPST says about the use of assessment data. It says that assessment data is used for enhancing the teaching and learning practices and programs of our schools. So we go back to this Venn diagram where you have the zone of proximal development. So we said last time that when our students are able to do things on their own without our assistance, that means they are already at the ZAD. That's the zone of actual development. When they're able to do things, however they need our assistance, they still need support coming from us or coming from parents or any significant person in that learning process, then that student is still performing at the zone of proximal development. When students are not able to do things even with the necessary support, so that means that's outside the ZPD. So when you say ZPD, the student will be able to get it right. The student will be able to perform a task properly with support. That is the zone of proximal development. Eventually, students will mature, students will be able to develop those skills further so that we can remove the supports and they can now do those tasks without our assistance. And now they would be performing at ZAD, or the zone of actual development. It is important to note, and for you also as teachers to know, that it's very difficult when a student can't do anything even with your support. That means the student is not ready. And if you look at this Venn diagram, that particular circle, you will see the comment, currently beyond their reach. So if a student can't do something even with your support, that means whatever you're targeting is beyond what the student can reach. So take note of that, and we'll go back to that later. And so how do we know where our students are? How do we know if they're at their ZAD or their ZPD? Or how do we know that it's clearly out of their reach? Now, there are two ways by which we can find out. And one is when we assess with or without scaffolding and through proportion correct. And so I'm going to explain what that is. Let's take a look at this photo in this slide where you have, painters painting the top of a house near the roof. And for them to be able to get to the roof, they need the scaffold. So it's good to have mental pictures about words that we use in education, just so we have an idea of what exactly is expected of us. So teachers are expected to provide scaffolding. But then again, scaffolding is like a big word. And so we're trying to figure, so what does that mean? So let's have this visual picture. So you have this house, and that upper section near the roof needs to be painted. Definitely, the painter is not tall enough to get to that point. And so the painter needs a scaffold. The painter needs those metal bars to reach that point. Well, of course, the painter will never grow as tall as the roof or grow that length. However, this is a good picture of what it means to scaffold. A scaffold, or to scaffold means to provide temporary assistance to our students so that they can complete a task, so that they can develop new understandings, so that later on, they can do things on their own. So you can remove the support and they could do it on their own. And again, if they can do it on their own, that's called the zone of actual development. But if they can do it, but only with your assistance, they are still performing at the zone of proximal development. So that's a very important concept to remember. And so that means we can assess with or without scaffolding. So again, we can assess with or without support. Now, there are 3 categories of supports that can be done. For example, you can have an assessment, an activity, where instead of students just thinking about the answer, they are provided real-life objects that they can use. Sometimes in mathematics, this is more commonly used, where you have manipulatives, actual objects like chips, etc., the children can use to figure out the answer to a particular problem. And that is an example of giving them an activity and providing support. So instead of just them thinking about what the correct answer is, you provide them things that will help them be able to answer the question. So you have here on this slide a list of things that provide support to students, and we call them sensory supports. So you can have real objects, actual pictures, diagrams. You can even use magazines, videos, models, demonstrations, etc. So if you assess and you need to add something to that assessment, like a support, that means you're assessing with scaffolds. Now, you can also assess with graphic supports. So for example, again, instead of students just doing it in their heads, trying to figure out what the correct answer is, you can provide a chart, a graphic organizer, tables, graphs, timelines, infographics. And if you do the assessment with this, that means you are assessing with scaffold. Now, if you take the supports out, if you remove the sensory supports, if you remove the graphic supports, then that means you are assessing without scaffolding. Well, not only are there sensory supports and graphic supports, you will also note that there can be interactive supports, such as doing an assessment activity with a partner. So if you do it with the partner provides some support. But then later on, if you want to check if the student is able to do it individually, then they stop working in pairs. Group work is also an example of a scaffold that represents interactive support. You can also have interviews, discussions, and also some mentors. Those are examples of interactive supports. Again, if you assess, so again, you have activities that you do with your students. If they do the activity with any of these supports, that means you are assessing with scaffolding. If you remove any of these supports, that means you are assessing without a scaffold. And that goes now to tell you where the students are. Do you remember? Okay, but I'll go back to the illustration later. So this is an example that was presented in session 5. So for example, your student, you want the student to react to a text that he or she has read. And the learning competency is to react to what is asserted or expressed in a text. So what do you do? Will the student just write that automatically if you ask the question? Some of us, knowing that our students don't really know how to do it yet, may want to add guide questions. So instead of just going straight to writing a paragraph, writing his or her reaction to what was read, some guide questions can be given. And so when the student answers the guide questions, then in effect, the student is already reacting to what he or she read. And so the provision of guide questions is an example of a scaffold. But if you don't provide guide questions for the student to be able to write or to react to the text, then that means there are no scaffolds. So if a student is able to do the task, if the student is able to react without guide questions, you know already that the student is at ZAD, or zone of actual development. But if the student needs those guide questions to be able to give you for them to be able to react, then that means they're still at ZPD, or the zone of proximal development level. So again, so let's just review. So this was the Venn diagram that we showed you earlier. Those who can do the task without any scaffolding are already at ZAD. They have mastered the skill. But for those of your students who can only do things when you provide guide questions, when you provide any of those supports, a sensory, graphic, or interactive support, then they are still at the zone of proximal development. And so what do you do? That we will find out later. And so you will also find in your class that there will be students, even with the necessary supports, cannot do what you're expecting them to be able to do. So that means whatever it is that you're targeting is beyond their reach. And this means backtracking, taking several steps backwards. This means further dividing the task into simpler tasks. And that's what we do for students who cannot do even when scaffolded. Okay, let me go back to that later. And so this particular slide again was shown to you in session 5. So if the student can do the task without the help of guide questions, that means the student has reached a high level in terms of achieving whatever competency you're targeting. The student must be at ZAD level. And so the assumption is whether you provide the guide questions or not, whether you provide the scaffold or not, the student can do the task. The student must be in their zone of actual development. But if the student needs the guide questions, if the students can only do the task with support from you, their classmate, or a particular material, that tells you that the student is at ZPD level, zone of proximal development. So that student is performing at mid-level. And if a student cannot do a task, regardless of what you do, regardless of the supports that you provide, then that means that particular student is performing at low level. And as I've said earlier, that will require you to further break down the task into subtasks. And hopefully, with the breaking down, with the task analysis and breaking down of the task, the student will move now to ZPD. Okay, so what are some things that we can do if our students will, how do we know now if they are at ZPD or ZAD? And again, they do it with or without scaffolds. And so when we do distance learning, this means that maybe if you need to make a call to support the student to do a task, that's an example of a scaffold. You may even provide supports again. If you have a messenger group and they're able to chat with each other while doing the activity, that's an example of a scaffold. Also, when students, for example, are given a similar activity and then they get to do that activity again, that is also an example of a scaffold. So if you give your students practice activities, you let them do group chats while doing an activity, or you provide them some materials to go with the worksheet, for example, that you gave them, or if you are in actual conversation with them via chat or phone or a phone call, that means you are providing scaffold. But if your student can do the activity without all of these, then definitely that tells you where the student is, and the student is actually performing at a high level, at ZAD level. So next, so again, so how do you know where your students are? The first one is when you assess them, if you provide scaffolds and without scaffolds, that will tell you where your student is. With scaffold, ZPD; without scaffold, ZAD. Now, many times in teaching, we use proportion correct. And by proportion correct, it tells you now like the number of the correct answers that the student got. But what I need to remind you is this. Sometimes we have tests that have many items, but make sure that the items are measuring the same learning competency. Because many times we put several learning competencies in just one test, and proportion correct is not the best way to determine if the student answered, or it's not the best way to determine if your students are at ZAD or ZPD if the items represent different learning competencies. Again, let me repeat that. If you decide to do proportion correct, please make sure that the items that you put in whatever activity it is demonstrate the target skill or represent the target skill or the target competency. It's not a mix of target skills, not a mix of target competencies. If you just focus on one competency and then you have several items representing that one competency, then proportion correct is something that you can use. And so proportion correct gives our students multiple opportunities to show, to demonstrate if they have acquired the target skill or competency. But when we do proportion correct, we no longer provide scaffolds. Okay, no more scaffolds. And so the proportion correct, like the score will tell you where the student is. Is the student at ZAD or at ZPD? But then again, when we do proportion correct, the students or we make a judgment out of independent performance. Independent because we don't provide supports. We don't provide scaffolds. So let me show you how this looks like in the Venn diagram. When your students get 75% of the items correctly in that activity that you prepared that represents only one competency, then you know that the student is performing at the zone of actual development. However, if the student score is between 25% to 75%, then that means that student will be able to acquire whatever skill that is, but with your support. With your support, that means you need to be able to provide the students some sensory, graphic, or interactive support so that the student gets to master the competency. Now, if the student gets lower than 25% of the activity, then that tells you that whatever it is that you're targeting, whatever competency it is that you're targeting, that is currently beyond the reach of the student. So take note, because many of us would just do 50% and then we move on to the next topic. 50% tells you that the student is still performing at the zone of proximal development. The student has not mastered the skill yet. If the student shows you a score of 75% or higher, again, representing only one type of learning competency, then the student now is performing at ZAD. Okay, please remember these proportions: 75, ZAD, 75 and up, ZAD. Anything lower than 75%, but till around 25% is ZPD. Anything lower than 25% is not within the reach of the student. Okay, so let's take a look at this example. If you have a 10-item worksheet, 8 out of 10 correct answers is ZAD. That's a high level. And so that means you can move on really to the next lesson for these students. But if you have students who are still getting scores of 3 out of 7, 3 to 7 out of 10 items, then that means they are in the ZPD. They need your help. They need your assistance. They need the scaffolds. They need the supports. We should not move on to the next lesson if they are performing at this level. And if your students are just getting 2 out of 10 items, that means they're not ready. They're not even ready with supports. So that means we need to backtrack, further analyze the competency, further break it down so that we can focus on the prerequisite skills that are needed so that the student is able to learn, at least be at a position to learn the target learning competency. And so again, there are 2 ways by which you can interpret the scores of our students or where our students are in relation to the progression. So first, we assess with or without scaffolds. Second, we can do proportion correct. And so what can we do? What do we do? If your student has already mastered the skill, then we provide more practice, independent practice in particular. And we do this so that they can become very fluent at demonstrating whatever skill that is. And so it becomes more automatic for the child or for the student to demonstrate the skill. And so when your student is already at ZAD level, when your student has already mastered, then what you can do is just to provide reminders. And then some more practice activities so that they can, they can practice whatever it is that you're teaching them, but again, without assistance. And then you can provide feedback as to how they are performing the tasks that you have assigned them. However, it's different if your students are in ZPD. When your students are at the zone of proximal development, that means you need to provide support. And by support, this is what we mean. You can model the skill. You can model it. So if the competency is reacting to a text that has been read, then we teachers would have to be able to model, to demonstrate what it means to react to a text that we have read. Or we can provide graphic organizers. Sometimes we can also look at examples of reactions that students can read, and we could say, oh, this is an example of a reaction. So let's try to analyze the reaction. So what are some parts that you see in that reaction? You can also list down the steps like guide questions, and these represent thinking protocols. And also, as what we said for students in ZAD, we also provide feedback again. If you will note, feedback is always important, whether your students have mastered the task or whether they are still learning the task with your support, feedback is always important. And so do not try, if you have students who are getting 2 out of 10, that tells you the student is not ready to learn the competency that you are teaching. And to assess them at that level where you know already that they're not ready for that level is not proper. It's not proper for teachers to assess competencies that are far beyond the learner's capacity. Okay, so please remember that. And so, as I've said earlier, feedback is very important. Feedback is so important. And by providing feedback, we are able to guide our students. Not only do teachers provide feedback, even parents can provide some feedback with also some assistance from us. We'll discuss that in a bit. But assessment and feedback is shared responsibility, not only for teachers, but also for learners as well as parents. So, okay, I'm going to skip this. I'm going straight to feedback, which is a very important use of assessment interpretation. Now, feedback is used to improve learning. So I hope that's very clear to us. We've been saying that same thing last meeting, and so we're doing it again today. Feedback is very important. But feedback, so it says here, you could read it on the slide, feedback complexity refers to how much and what information should be included in a feedback message. By feedback complexity, I don't mean a long feedback. Feedback complexity is not the same as the length of the feedback. No. Feedback complexity, again, refers to what should be included in a message. And what should be included? Okay. Let me skip this first. And I'm going to this. What should be included in a feedback? There are 3 things that we need to include. The student needs to know where the student is going. What is the target competency? The student needs to know how he or she is performing, where the student is in relation to that competency. And if you know that there is a gap between where the student needs to be and where the student is, the student needs information on how to get to that point, how to narrow the gap, how to close the gap. And so a good feedback has these 3 information: where the student is going, how the student is performing, and how the student will get to where he needs to be. So, and when we say feedback complexity, that is the kind of feedback that we mean. And so, for example, when you have a self-learning module and you have answer keys in the self-learning module. So if the student goes to the answer key, the student knows whether he or she got the correct answer. However, it is not enough to know the correct or the right answer. And so knowing if you got an item right or wrong is not enough. It is feedback, yes, but just saying what he or she got correct or wrong cannot be considered efficient feedback. And so an elaborate feedback is needed. And this is where we said that we will consider the 3 feedback questions. Where am I going? Where am I now? And how do I get there? And so elaborated feedback should have that. And so the student now knows how to strategize. You know, there was a question, what will happen if we don't provide feedback? Then the students will continue on guessing if as to how he got the correct answer. By providing good feedback, the you are eliminating guessing. The student knows why he got the item correctly or why he got a wrong answer. By not giving elaborated feedback, by just simply limiting yourself to correct or wrong answer, that means the student doesn't know. In Filipino, chamba, we don't want our students to just be guessing. We want them to know where they are. If they got an answer correctly, why was it correct? Why was it wrong? And so last time, when we were talking about the self-learning modules, a good self-learning module would have answer keys that also try to explain in simpler terms why that answer is the preferred answer. So we looked at 3 feedback questions. So that's very important when you're giving feedback. And we also learned this last time, the 4 levels of feedback. And we said that in terms of the levels of feedback, that the most important type of feedback is one that helps our students become independent learners. That's why we said that self-regulation type of feedback, feedback that helps students to monitor themselves, is a very good type of feedback. So we will review that in a bit. Feedback that talks about the process, that helps students understand the problem or to understand the process needed to perform a task, is also good feedback. Also useful feedback is feedback about the task, like how well the student understood the task or how well a student performed. Now, the least type of feedback, the least helpful type of feedback is the self-level type of feedback, where we give personal evaluations all about our students, like very good, good, but good what? Very good what? Children don't really know what you are praising. And so to be able to add specifics to what you are saying, not just limiting your feedback to good, very good, awesome, etc. You need to add something to what you're saying to our students. What was good? What was very good? Children need to know what they were good at. And so going back to what was presented in session 5, an example of self-level type, the lowest level type of feedback is, you give great advice, good work. So it is, it gives you a boost. It probably inspires you, but it doesn't tell you if how to get to where you need to be. So in that sense, this is insufficient. Well, another type of feedback is the task feedback, like this. You can improve your concluding paragraph by rephrasing or reiterating your main points in the introduction and body. So this kind of feedback tells the student, okay, this is how you can improve, instead of letting your students guess how they can improve. Another is to give them feedback about the process. And the example here is, you can make the steps more engaging by giving supporting details. And this can be additional information or an interesting fact or tidbit or a useful tip. So this is about the process now. Quite similar to the task, except that this more or less tells you, okay, this is what you can further do to make good your work. And this is considered effective feedback. Now, for self-regulation, so again, for self-regulation, we want to develop independent learners. So this is an example of a feedback, like the steps you have written are clear. You were able to use cohesive devices that indicate the sequence of steps in a process. You can check to see if there are other sentences. You can check to see if there are other sentences that could be more clearly stated using a connector, meaning you're giving back the task to the student. Okay, so this is feedback on what you have written. Okay, go check your other sentences. So which of them could be written more clearly? And so instead of you pointing out, okay, improve this, you're now letting the student, okay, take a look at your work. which of these can be improved? And that is one example of a feedback that allows our students to become independent learners. And so again, and I'd like to focus on the last statement on this particular slide. Feedback provided without any information on how to accomplish a task will not promote learning. Again, feedback should provide information on how to accomplish a task. So if you're not providing any information on how to help the student accomplish the task, then that means we are not teaching, we are not promoting learning. So always remember that. And so we said also that we need for feedback to be timely and immediate. But the challenge is, how do you do that when you are teaching remotely? So you can do this. One, we said last time, make sure that your self-learning module has answer keys with some explanation on the correct answer. But there are other things that you can do. You can write short notes. You can use or have like a checklist of what it means to have a good paragraph, or to have for example, a good reaction to a text. So you can write down all the steps there, and the students the students can use that as a guide. So also you can send text messages, you can do phone calls, you can do chats. What you can do also is to, you can add photos. Like, for example, the student gave you some work to do. The student submitted to you a seat work. You can put your comments there, take a photo, and then upload the photo to your chat. It's amazing the things that we can do via Facebook Messenger. You can even append videos. If you need to give instructions, then you can do that. Okay. Also, you can, and this is what I meant by adding an audio or video file to the feedback, which you can upload to the chat. You can also, for example, if the student submitted a word in, let's say, MS Word, then you can add a comment there. Also, if you will allow classmates to give feedback to work done by other students, then there has to be some rules. Remember, sometimes our students can be very blunt. And so it's always good to have rules on how to respond to work that they have read. And the last thing we want is for classmates to criticize each other. No, that's not what we want. We want feedback that is helpful, that will help students accomplish the task. And so in summary, when we do assessment interpretations day by day or between lessons, that means we are going through a process where we want to know where our students are. Are they at ZAD? Are they at ZPD? And so two ways by which you can determine where they are is, one, to assess using scaffolds, and to assess without scaffolds. So with or without, assessing with or without scaffolds. Again, when you assess, when a student gets it right with scaffold, the student is still at the zone of proximal development. If the student is able to do the activity without scaffolds, then the student is already at ZAD. Again, for proportion correct, when students are able to get 75% of the items representing one learning competency correct, that means they are at ZAD. If they are getting scores between 25% and lower than 75%, they are at ZPD. So that means they need you, they need support. And if they are scoring below 25%, they are not ready for the lesson. You need to backtrack. You need to further divide whatever it is that you're targeting. Make sure that the student has the prerequisite skills for the target competency. So assessment data can be used three ways. You use it for grading and reporting. You use it to improve teaching and learning, and we use it to provide feedback to our learners. And so we need to provide the appropriate level of feedback. We like feedback that helps our students become independent learners. And while it is positive to give self-level feedback, I hope that we will take more time to provide process, task, or self-regulation type of feedback. And so remember the three feedback questions. Where am I going? What competency it is that we're targeting? Where am I in relation to that competency? And how do I get there? So remember those three feedback questions, and remember the 4 feedback levels. Okay, so some reflection questions. Okay, I think I took so much time already, but I'll do this very fast. So how can I improve the achievement of the students with low-level learning, even when they are provided with the necessary support and yet they are not making much improvement? When your students are not improving even with support, that means they are at a level where they're not ready for that competency. As I've said earlier, you need to backtrack, look for the prerequisite skills, and that is where you need to begin. Look for the prerequisite skills, develop those in the student, then go back to the learning competency that you're targeting. Because if the student had the prerequisite skills, the student should be able to give you the correct answer with support. But even if with support, still the student cannot get it right. The student doesn't have the prerequisite skills. Next, is it all right to use generic feedback? Yes. Yes, to students at more or less at the same level. And actually, when we do class discussions with students, it's really generic feedback that we provide. But again, make sure that the kind of feedback that you give is that you're mindful of feedback complexity, that it has all the necessary elements of good feedback. And then, how do you know if the students really did the tasks themselves? Ask them, talk to them. And that's what we typically do. We give them questions to answer. And then if they're not able to answer, that is a sign that someone else did the task for them. What will happen if you don't give students feedback regularly? The students will not know the correct answer. Well, they will not know if they are meeting the target outcomes. They will be guessing. And the last thing we want is for our students to guess what they did right, what they did wrong. We want our students to be sure about what they do in our classes. And by providing feedback, we will be able to give them that necessary knowledge to become independent learners. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Teacher Therese. That was a very informative discussion. It's really important that we don't just collect data from assessments, but we also interpret and use the results. This will also allow us to determine or identify who among our students need assistance. Now, let's go to session 6. Our resource speaker is Dr. Carl Santos. Dr. Santos is a senior research fellow at the Assessment, Curriculum, and Technology Research Center. He is an associate professor at the Educational Research and Evaluation area of the College of Education in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He finished his PhD in statistics in the same university last 2018. He was a visiting research scholar at the Graduate School of Education in Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and a postdoctoral fellow in cognitive diagnosis modeling at the Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong. His research interests include item response theory, cognitive diagnosis modeling, sampling designs, and analysis of large-scale educational assessment data. Let's give the spotlight to Dr. Kevin Carl Santos for the summary and highlights of Session 6.
Good morning again, everyone. Good morning, teachers. So before I start this summary and highlights for session 6, I would like to congratulate each and every one of you for reaching this point. So you're already at the end of module 1B. So for this section, I'm going to talk about summary and highlights of the last session for module 1B, which is all about evaluation of the assessment process. So before we proceed with the other slides, let me just share this with you. This is from the Missouri State University. So I just got this one because it caught my attention and I think it's very suitable to our session for this morning. So it says here that assessment is a constant cycle of improvement. Data gathering is ongoing. So specifically, I would like to emphasize the first one. Assessment is a constant cycle of improvement. And so I think that is basically the reason why we are evaluating our assessment process. So let us just recall, since this is the last session in Module 1B, that in across the different sessions, we talk about, first in session 2, we talk about planning for assessment. Whether you're doing formative or summative assessment, you have to plan for your assessment. And then for the session 3 talked about collection of evidence. Are you collecting the right evidence, the correct evidence from the students? And sessions 4 and 5 talked about interpreting and using evidence. Now, after doing that, whether it's formative or summative assessment process, the last step is to evaluate our entire assessment process. So that is the topic for session number 6. So recall that in this session, our research officer, Carissa, talked about reflective practice and importance of evaluating the assessment process. So Finlay described reflective practice as learning through and from experience towards gaining new insights of self and practice. So basically what we would like to emphasize here is that the process of reflective practice has no end. So it always aims at the improvement of practice, and in our context, the improvement of teaching and assessment practices. So we can just go back to the first slide that I showed you earlier, that assessment is it's an ongoing process of improvement. So there's always an area of improvement, and we have to do something about it. So how do we know how to improve that? Reflective practice plays an important role there. So we also distinguish these two in session 6, reflection in action and reflection on action. So when you say reflection in action, you are, as a teacher, you can reflect as something happens. So for example, in a typical face-to-face classroom discussion, you can do reflection in action. So for example, let's say you do a classroom discussion or class recitation, you can consider the situation based on the responses of the students. For example, let's say you ask them to read a particular short story or an essay, and then you are testing them or assessing them by asking questions, and you see that a lot of students still do not get or understood that particular short story or essay. So right there and then, you have to decide how to act, and you have to act immediately. So for example, there's a particular thing that they don't understand or they don't know how to do. Then as a teacher, after reflecting that, you can think of ways on how to address that learning gap. So how can you do that? So for example, before proceeding to the next topic or next lesson, what you can do is to explain further that short story, so that you will ensure that all students have understood it before proceeding to the next topic. So that's actually reflection in action. Now, the other one is reflection on action. Here, we are reflecting after something happens. we can reconsider the situation and think about what needs changing for the future. So, in other words, this is not an instant reflection. Let's say for a particular quarter, you can reflect after a particular quarter and see whether what are the activities, for example, that the students enjoy. What are the things or assessment methods that I think did not work, and what are the assessment methods that work for the students. So there, when you do that reflection, you can reconsider the situation and think of ways on how to adjust or to improve that in the next quarter. So that is reflection and action. So basically the difference is it's not, you don't act immediately on reflection and action. Uh, we also distinguish the evaluation of assessment process with formative assessment and summative assessment. So as you can see, across all three columns, the actor is the teacher. So as a teacher, you are the actor when it comes to formative assessment, when it comes to summative assessment, as well as our topic for this session, which is evaluation of the assessment process. However, your partners change. For formative and summative assessments, students are your partners. Whereas in evaluation of assessment process, here your partners are your peers, your co-teachers, or your colleagues. It can be your mentors, your master teachers, or it can be administrators, let's say your school heads or area coordinator. And your subject here is your assessment practice because that's what you would like to evaluate. And of course, your purpose here is why are you evaluating your assessment process? Because you would like to improve teaching and assessment practices. So that is the difference of evaluation of assessment process compared to formative and summative assessments. Now, these are the different considerations when we evaluate our assessment process. The first one is we have to review the quality of assessment process. So the question now is, how can you review the quality of your assessment process? So this can be done. So first, you can look into the suitability of assessment outcomes for the intended purpose. You have to go back to your planning, for example. What is the purpose of this assessment method or this assessment task? Is it suitable? Assess its suitability. Does it serve its purpose? So that's one way on how to review the quality of your assessment process. And this can also be done by looking or examining all parts of the assessment process. So the assessment process that we mentioned is the entire uh, diagram that I showed earlier. So you start with planning for the assessment, and then the middle one is wherein you collect your evidence, you interpret and use it, and then of course the last one is the evaluation, which is what we're talking right now. So you can pick one of them, one of the stages there, or you can examine all of them. So that's one way on how to review the quality of the assessment process. And in session 6, we showed this framework on evaluating a formative assessment practice. So as you can see, it's a cycle. But here we start with selecting a part to investigate. So earlier I said you can examine all parts of the assessment process, or you can just focus on just one part. So are you going to investigate the planning stage when you plan your assessment? Are you going to investigate how you collected your evidence, or how you interpreted or used your evidence? So after selecting that part of that part, the next step is to explore your own current practices relevant to the selected part. So for example, you choose evidence collection. So for that one, you have to explore your own current practices relevant to evidence collection. And these are some of the guide questions that you can use to help you in exploring your own current practices relevant to your selected part. So for example, you can make an initial self-evaluation first. These are the questions that you can answer. What are the examples of this part in practice? How well do my teaching practices address this part, and what outcomes might be connected to my teaching practices related to this part? After making an initial self-evaluation, you gather evidence of practice. So for example, who seems to be an exemplar in this area. So an exemplar could be, let's say, your co-lead, your co-teacher. It could be your master teacher, or it could be your area coordinator as well. And your exemplar can also be someone from a different school, or let's say a different country. Also, what documents can I review? So in gathering evidence of practice, it might be useful to look for different documents that shows the current practices in that selected part. So you can check, for example, journal articles or reports from other from publications here and abroad. What can I synthesize from my data collection as well? So after gathering this evidence of practice, what can you synthesize from that data collection? And lastly, you make a plan. So after going back, you make an initial self-evaluation, then you gather evidence of practice, and the last part is to make a plan to implement new practice. So what do I do differently? What specific practices am I going to change or introduce? Because earlier you look for exemplars in that area. You look also from documents that you can review, and based on that, what are the specific practices that you can adopt so that you can introduce it to your teaching or to your classroom instruction. What advice does the exemplar give for implementing this strategy? So you can ask your exemplar some advice on what are the efficient ways on implementing these strategies and how to avoid potential problems. So that is the last part in this exploring your own current practices relevant to the selected part. Now, the third part is after exploring your own current practices, you have to implement your change, the changes that you based on this last part, based on your plan. So here, improvement of assessment practice is an ongoing effort. As you can see, there's a mini cycle within that stage in the implementation of changes. It's an ongoing effort of implementing, reflecting, and revising, and therefore it requires learning and practice as well. And then lastly, after implementing the changes, you reflect on the changes that you've made. So as going back to earlier, we said that reflective practice plays an important role in the evaluation of the assessment process. As you can see, it's in this diagram, in this framework, reflection is an integral part as well. So these are also some of the guide questions that you can answer when you are evaluating your assessment process. So first, how well do my teachings practices address the concerns on the identified part now? What do the related outcomes look like now? What evidence have I collected from the students? So this is the part wherein are you collecting the correct evidence? Are you collecting evidence, or are you assessing them in the zone of proximal development, for example? What are my next steps after this? Were the changes in my assessment practice worth the effort? Because probably you can introduce some changes, but some changes might, let's say, if you introduce a new assessment practice, it might take so much of your time in classroom discussion. So you might want to reconsider that. So that's why number 5 is also important. And then number 6 is, do I still have other concerns? So these are some of the questions that you can use when you reflect on the changes that you've made in your assessment practices. So basically, this is something that you can follow when you are evaluating your assessment process. And whether you're doing formative assessment or summative assessment, the last part is the same. You select a part to investigate. The second step is to explore your own current practices, and then implement changes, and lastly, you reflect on the changes. The next consideration in evaluating the assessment process is reviewing the effectiveness of the teaching and learning process. So what is the teaching and learning process? That is the middle part here, referring to the assessment process in doing formative assessment. So as you can see, it's a cycle. So you collect evidence, which is the topic of session 3, and then you interpret the evidence and use the evidence as well. So these were the topics in sessions 4 and 5. So you going back, you have to review the effectiveness of the teaching and learning process. So let me just recall this some important points about assessment with regards to the teaching and learning process. assessment is embedded in the learning process. It is tightly interconnected with the curriculum and instruction. This has been emphasized in the previous synchronous session as well. And so assessment plays a constant role in informing instruction, and then it also it plays an important role in guiding your students' next steps and in checking and their progress and achievement. And so this is the reason why we are looking at the effectiveness or reviewing the effectiveness of the teaching and learning process. Do your assessment methods play these roles? So that's the question that you can answer in answering or in reviewing the teaching and learning process. Teachers may use many different processes and strategies for classroom assessment and adapt them to suit the assessment purpose and needs of the individual students. And so, therefore, I'm just emphasizing here the importance of assessment in the teaching and learning process because it plays a role in the instruction and in guiding the students and monitoring their student learning. So these are some questions that you can ask yourself, probably focusing in the middle part of the diagram that we showed earlier. Have you collected the appropriate evidence? So you may recall can go back to session 3 and go back to learning what learning progression is, and then remember that we talked about the zone of proximal development, that you have to assess the skills or tasks in the zone of proximal development so that you'll know how you can support your students. Have you interpreted the evidence correctly? So earlier, Dr. Bustos mentioned the different ways on how to interpret the evidence and use your evidence. Have you used it to adjust your classroom instruction to address learning gaps, for example? Have you provided the appropriate level of feedback to learners? This was emphasized in the previous session. And then, are the feedbacks beneficial to learners as well? So these are the things that you can answer when you are reviewing the effectiveness of teaching and learning process. And then lastly, under the evaluation of assessment process, we decide on actions that will build on strengths and improve the weaknesses for the future. And one of the things that was mentioned under this one is you can join a learning community. In DepEd Order number 35 series of 2016, it mentioned or described what a learning action cell is. So basically, it's a group of teachers who engage in collaborative learning sessions to solve shared challenges encountered in the school, facilitated by your school head or a designated learning action cell leader. So basically, it's a learning community wherein it includes your peers, your co-teachers, your mentors, or probably master teachers, area coordinators, school head, or principal. Now, why is it important to establish a learning community? So, as I've said earlier, it's collaborative learning. So, you learn from others, and these others refer to your workmates, your office mates, your co-teachers, your master teachers, area coordinators, school heads. Because learning community or a learning action cell, it serves as an avenue to learn about trends in formative assessment. So, as I've said, you learn also from others. Probably your co-teachers are they have best practices in that particular field. So, for example, in reading, those practices work for their students. So, if they can share that in a group or a learning community, then you can also learn that from them and you can adapt it also in your classroom instruction. So, in other words, you learn from each other. It can also serve as a support group with whom you can talk about new ideas and obtain feedback as well. So, as a teacher, you can also ask for your colleagues for feedback. You can ask them, let's say, to observe in your classroom this discussion and tell them to give you feedback on what you think are the things that you can improve on. And then, as I've said, lastly, learning community is collective learning. You learn from others as well. Not necessarily in the same field or in the same learning area, but you can also learn from others coming from different areas of learning areas. Let's say, if you're from reading or English, you can also learn from teachers from teaching Araling Panlipunan, probably science as well, and so on. So in summary, in session 6, these are the things, the important points that were emphasized. So first, evaluation of assessment process is necessary to inform continuous improvement. Second, evaluation of the assessment process is carried out by looking at the quality of assessment process, the effectiveness of teaching and learning process, and identifying actions that will build on the strengths and weaknesses of the future for the future. And lastly, implementing changes to your assessment is an iterative process. So it's a never-ending process. There's always room for improvement. So sometimes probably you'll say, this method or this assessment method is being enjoyed by my students. But one thing that you should also think about is the type of students that we teach. They also change from one generation to another. So meaning nothing is constant. Some assessment methods may work well for a particular group or for a particular generation, but for a different generation, maybe you have to adapt, you have to modify your assessment practices. So it's an iterative practice. Oh, that sums up the session 6, which is evaluation of assessment process. Now, let me just go to some of the questions from the reflection log. So first, what is the significance and purpose of evaluating assessment in teaching and learning process? So earlier, I already emphasized why assessment, is important in the teaching and learning process. So why is it important to evaluate that? So let me just add some points there by stating this, that assessment is the ongoing process of gathering, analyzing, and interpreting evidence, reflecting on findings, and making informed judgment to improve student learning. Hence, we evaluate whether, so this is the part of the teaching and learning process, we evaluate whether first, do teachers use inferences about student progress to inform their teaching? Second, do students reflect on and monitor their progress to inform their future learning goals? And lastly, do teachers use evidence of student learning to make judgment on student achievement against their learning goals? So, to answer the question, what is the significance and purpose of evaluating assessment? We have to go back. What are the uses of assessment? What is assessment? What are the uses of assessment? And um, the significance and purpose of evaluating the assessment in the teaching and learning process is to ensure that these 3 points here that was mentioned here below are being done by the teachers and by the students as well, to ensure that you are doing your job as a teacher and students are doing their job also, but because they can reflect and monitor their progress as well. The second one is in a small school wherein there is no master teacher or to evaluate the assessment practice of the teacher, to whom he or she can ask help, considering the school head and the teacher are not on the same field of specialization. So going back to the slides on learning action cell or learning community, I think you may still ask help from your school head or even your colleagues coming from different fields of specialization. Note that assessment tasks or practices are not necessarily exclusive to a particular field or discipline. So you may still get insights or advice or suggestions from them, even if they are from different fields or learning area. Another thing that you can also consider is you can look for best practices that is being done, let's say, by other schools or being done abroad. So you can look for documents such as, let's say, publications or journal articles on the best practices on your particular learning area. Number 3, how evaluation of assessment process improve teaching and learning in modular paint distance learning. So there are several people or teachers that ask same questions in the context of modular distance learning. So I included here some questions that you can use to evaluate your assessment process. Typically, when you're using modules, there are already assessments that are included in that. And some of the teachers have been asking this already before, that if there are already assessments included in the module, can I add additional assessments or tasks to the students? The answer is yes. So that's actually to answer that. Actually, you have to assess or evaluate your assessment process or the assessment tasks that are included in the module. So, for example, you can ask yourselves, are the assessments included in the module sufficient already? Do they assess what the learners know and can do? Second, are the assessments included in the modules valid? Are they aligned with the content or knowledge content? Third is, do the assessments deliver feedback to the student to identify his or her misunderstanding and get guidance on how to improve? So I think number three is a very, very important, right? So do the assessment in the module uh, deliver feedback to the students so that they'll know their misunderstanding or misconceptions, and then they do they do the feedback do they get guidance on how to improve as well? So if the answer is no, for example, then you have to do something about it, right? So another question that you can reflect on is, are the results communicated to them in a timely manner? Is remedial support provided if needed? So if the feedback is not timely, for example, what can you do? So earlier, Dr. Bustos mentioned some of the options, and I would like to emphasize some of them. You can provide feedback to students through mailed or emailed instructions and tasks. Mailed for some teachers that who have students from living in very remote areas, so they can try mailed instructions instead. Although, again, that's something that's beyond our control already. If it will take a little some time before you can get response from them. Messaging platforms also, if there is low connectivity, for example, you can use some messaging platforms like, say, Facebook Messenger. Direct phone calls also are between teachers, students, and even parents can also be utilized. So here in the modular distance mode of distance learning, if you evaluate your assessment process, which is typically the assessments are already included in the modules, then you can also you can improve teaching and learning if you think that they are not enough. So, for example, for some students, you think that those assessments are good enough or sufficient to them, but for some, it's not clear. For example, there are some teachers saying the reflection log that, how can I know whether the student is answering the assessments in the module? Actually, that's actually part of the reflection, right? So you think that you think that probably these are answered by their parents, not by the students. So that's actually part of evaluating your assessment. So that means that it's not sufficient to just give them just the assessments in the module. So as a teacher, what I can do is, I can, let's say, for example, call the students and ask them similar questions that were asked in the assessment, and see whether they can answer the questions, so that you'll know whether they really understand or they really master that particular skill already. So those are things that you can do, but that's actually part of reflection or evaluating the assessment process. This is, I think, something that I wasn't able to mention earlier, that probably as teachers, if you've been teaching for years already, you've been doing evaluation of your assessment process already or practice. However, you are not you're not aware that you're already doing that, and eventually it will be embedded in your system that you will do this unintentionally or unconsciously. So that's actually it's a small example, but actually that's already evaluating your assessment practice. If you think, for example, that you're not getting or you're not collecting enough evidence from the students, or you're doubting that they're doing that by themselves, then you have to do something about it. So you have to, you have to implement changes in your assessment practice. And lastly, this is the last question. Is there a best way for me to assess the quality of assessment I give to my learners? What might be your suggestion about this? So I put here some bullets um, to that describe the quality or the effective assessment methods. So the assessment methods, to be effective, they should be directly related to the a particular learning outcome. That's the very important one. Next, they should be time efficient and manageable. Third, they should provide challenge for the full range of learners being assessed. Next, the assessment methods should be fair to all students, including those with additional needs. And lastly, they should be appropriate to where learners are in their learning. So this is referring to the learning progression. That's why it's very important to know where they are in the learning progression. So I think this is like a checklist, and then see whether your assessment will get a check on all these bullets. So that ends the questions from the reflection lines. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. We will now start our open forum. From the questions posted in the comment section of YouTube, Lalaine and I will choose some questions that will be answered by our resource speakers. Lalaine, what is the first question for our speaker today?
So here's our first question. How can teachers give grades to students if no output is given, especially at the end of grading period? So the teacher has already given remediation and has done home visitations, but still the student has not submitted any outputs.
From probably briefly, Lane, probably I'll give my insights about this. I think it's very important to know the reason, because if even if you're doing home visitations to give module, and you're giving remediation already, and yet the student is not providing or submitting outputs, then there might be a big reason why or big problem that the student is facing. And I think it's, as a teacher, it's important to determine what it is that is hindering the student from his or her optimal performance in school.
Okay. When a student doesn't give you the required work, the task of the teacher is to find out why. Because there are many assumptions that we have. But I'm happy, ma'am, that you mentioned that you did home visitations. And I think that's really a step towards the right direction. It's really trying to find out what's going on at home. Seriously, you know, if a student refuses to work, you need to be able to find out why. It is possible that the student has learning needs, probably needs special education, and maybe that's why the student is not able to comply. But sometimes they may not have the resources to do the work, etc. So again, home visitations is a step towards the right direction. Try to find out what's really causing the non-submission of work. And if you find out that maybe the student is, maybe the lessons are beyond what he can do, so that means the student really needs special education help. And maybe what you can do is to facilitate that he receives that kind of help. He or she receives that kind of help. That's all.
Thank you, Teacher Therese and Sir Kevin. So for the second question, may I know what is the best way to give elaborate feedbacks to my 281 grade 9 learners?
Okay, so who will attempt to do that? Okay, so I will attempt to do it, because sometimes we also find ourselves in similar situations when we teach tertiary, at the tertiary level. So number one, earlier there was a question in the reflection log. Is it okay to give a generic feedback? And to me that is okay. Why? Because as long as it tells you that it tells the student where he or she needs to go, how to get there. Now, students differ where they are in terms of the starting point. So some are more advanced, and so probably the gap between where they are and where they need to be is smaller. Others probably would have a larger gap. And so what I typically do is I group my students in terms of what I perceive to be their performance, what I perceive to be their starting point. And what I do is to create a generic response, really, talking about where they need to go and how to get there. Sometimes I'm not able to put it in writing. I just do it in class when we have discussion. So I tell them, okay, this is where we need to go. And so this is what you can do. So when you do class discussions with your students, actually you're doing it more or less in a generic manner. What we're saying and what we're trying to encourage you to do is to use your words to tell students where they need to go and how to get there. Because oftentimes we feel that we don't have time to do it. We skip that part. And so let's not skip that part. But again, you can, in terms of, because the good feedback will also have in it where students are. So the starting point. And so again, to do that, I would group my students who I think are at the same level. So I would give a generic feedback to them. So because definitely, teacher, I feel for you, you have 281 students, and that's really a big number of students. And so use your time to craft a good feedback. But a good feedback, again, is one that is understandable. So if you will use highfalutin English for your feedback, that will not work. Use simple English for your feedback. And I hope that would help. I don't know how Sir Kevin would do it for his huge classes also.
One thing that I do when although not in reading is to group the similar responses from students so that I'll know what kind of feedback I should give them. So this just an idea. One thing that you can try to do is something similar to probably to PISA. If you can probably refer to the DepEd report of PISA, wherein they have different score ranges, and then if the student score will fall in that particular range, there's a description on what reading skills a student can do, so that if you can provide, for example, let's say a short exam to them, and then the student will receive their scores, then you can automatically give them that particular description that these are the things that you can most likely do. And so as a student, you know what are the things that I cannot do also, because there's a range also of scores, and if I don't reach these scores, these are the skills these are the skills that I cannot do at this point. So probably that's one, but it might be tedious to do that also. But eventually, if you have a big class like this, or a huge number of students like this, that will be useful in the long run.
Actually, it's like a rubric in this case will be very helpful, because like in the rubric, the descriptors are already there, and you just like encircle which one fits, for example, a particular student's work. So that by itself is good feedback also. And that's one thing that you can use for huge classes.
Okay, thank you, Teacher Therese and Kevin, for those responses. So here's a concern from one of our participants. He or she is a bit apprehensive with the idea of messenger group chats in providing assistance to students. because grade 7 to 10 learners are all underage, and underage are not allowed to create FB accounts based on the community guidelines of Facebook. So here's the question. Does that mean that we tolerate them faking their demographics?
Definitely not. They use their parents' accounts. And that's what we do because many times, again, it's cheaper to use Messenger. Even the group chat and the group, do you call that the video chat? That's a lot cheaper to use. It uses less data compared to Zoom. And so, but we did this for young children. They use their parents' accounts. So does it mean that we tolerate them faking their demographics? Definitely not. But there are ways around it. You could use your parents' account to use it for the meetings. And maybe that has been the case also for the elementary students that we have been working with. There are other apps that there's actually Messenger Kids, but I haven't tried it yet. What has worked for us so far is using the parents' account as for Messenger meetings.
Okay, thank you, Teacher Therese. So for the next question, is it possible that students be the evaluators of the teacher's assessment practices? Can the student's high level of achievement be an indicator that your assessment practice is good enough?
I would say, for example, here, I would say that you can get students' input or evaluation for of a teacher's assessment practices. Similar to, like, say, in college, wherein you ask, we conduct student evaluation for teachers, and some of the questions there are pertaining to assessment. So I think that's an integral part also when you are doing reflections on your assessment practice, because you'll know their perspective. Not because earlier we're mentioning that you can talk, for example, to your colleagues or your school heads, but that's a different perspective, right? From the perspective of the students, that input is, I think, very essential also on how you can modify. As I said earlier, you can gather information from them to, let's say, what are the things or activities that they think are very difficult for them, or what are the activities or assessment methods that they enjoy, and you can use that in revising or you're evaluating your assessment process. So I think that their inputs will be valuable also. The other question is, can the student's high level of achievement be an indicator that your assessment practice is good enough? I maybe or maybe not. I don't think it's not necessarily, I guess. So because can the not necessarily, I think. So regarding that, so yeah, that's that's my answer. Not necessarily.
Teacher Therese, do you have any response to
Oh,
these questions?
yes. I go by what Sir Kevin said. I think, it can be an indication, your students' high achievement can be an indication of your assessment practice in a way. But sometimes, when we're given really smart students, and even with crummy teachers, they still they're still able to achieve. And so, not necessarily, but I think it can be one of the indicators that you're doing a good job. Yeah, just one among many indicators.
Thank you. Our fifth question is, am I getting the point that assessing my learners is embedded before, during, and after instruction?
Okay, so definitely you plan for assessment. And so I'd say that even before instruction, you have already set these things in place. In fact, the previous asynchronous sessions have been talking about that assessment planning is very important. It doesn't just happen at the end. So even during instruction and after instruction, yes. So I would say that yes, these are embedded in the activities. It doesn't mean that because it's assessment, it will happen after instruction. It really happens even during instruction. And this is where we do the minute by minute assessment. Remember the cycle, the minute by minute, and how is it possible to be assessing at that point? And that is because you're really responding to how students respond to you, to your prompts while the lesson is ongoing. And so, yes, teacher, assessment is an embedded process. In the whole instruction process, you plan for it. And then during instruction, you do your assessment still. It's embedded in the class activities that you do. And even after instruction, when you want to check if your students are able to do it independently, that's still part of the assessment process. And so I think, teacher, you're right in saying that it is, yes, embedded in the whole instruction process.
Right. Thank you. So Kevin, would you like to add something?
I have no further additional answer to that, except that I think there each stage there, before, during, and after instruction, each has its own use or purpose. So that's very important when you plan for your assessment.
Okay, thank you. So let me read the last question. Learner's mindset is just to submit, thus paying no attention to feedback. A culture embedded in their early school years. What mechanism can we do in secondary to have this change of behavior?
Well, definitely, I think the premium that we give to feedback is very important. If we go by the study done by the group of Sir Louis before, not very many teachers actually provide feedback. And that has helped establish this culture of not paying attention to feedback. And so it really begins with us individually. It's easy to blame the lower grades for not giving premium to feedback, but they're a separate group, no? This particular group is the secondary group. And I think what we can do is to begin with ourselves. Let's provide feedback. And let's make it our class culture, our own culture, to provide feedback to our students. And then hopefully, as with any other thing that we do, there will be ripple effects. And hopefully also, teachers in your school will be influenced to provide feedback. Because if people know that people at the secondary level do use feedback intentionally and efficiently, that will have ripple effects too to the elementary levels. And so let's do what we can with providing feedback. I know it's difficult, but it's something that we can do.
Kevin, do you have anything to add?
Um, I, I, I think the change of this behavior will take time, but it's not yet late to start this change. But I think it will also help, also, for example, to talk to, if it's possible, to talk to the students, so that they know exactly, because they, if you just provide feedback, for example, they may not read it, or I think the personal touch or personal connection of interaction of the teacher to the student by emphasizing the feedback will probably make the students appreciate it better. And probably it will also help if the teachers will also involve the parents to in making use of this feedback from the teachers. That's it, Lillian.
So this ends our open forum. To our resource speakers, thank you very much. Do you have any last words for our participants before we end our last synchronous session? Maybe we could start with Sir Kevin first, then he will be followed by Teacher Therese.
Again, I would like to congratulate all of you for finishing this module 1B. So I know it's very hard to do a lot of things all at the same time, no? With undergoing this module 1B and also your teaching as well and grading. So congratulations for that. Hopefully, we're able here with ACTRC, we're able to share with you some of the things that you can adopt when you do your teaching and your assessment also. Hopefully you will learn to put premium on giving importance to assessment and feedback as well, so that it will not only improve your classroom instruction but also will improve and monitor your students' learning as well.
Okay, so I look forward to a better Philippines, a better performance of students, not only national but international tests. I know it may not happen immediately, but over time, the Philippines will perform better in all of those assessments when we teachers take assessment seriously. Maraming salamat and congratulations for completing the course.
Thank you, Sir Kevin and Teacher Therese.
Before we end, we have the following reminders. If you are not done yet with all Module 1B sessions, the asynchronous sessions 1 to 6 will be available on Qualtrics until March 20, 2022. If you would like to rewatch the training videos, they will be available on our website starting February 7. Please use the link and password shown on the screen. All right, so that reminder or the password and link is in that slide. All right, so please remember also that you can rewatch the videos for your personal use only. Please do not share the link and password with others. Then please make sure that you have completed all activities that include the pre-test, sessions 1 to 6, and post-test. These will be reviewed for the issuance of certificates.
Other than that, here are a few more reminders. Feedback on the performance of participants will be emailed by last week of April. Again, we highly encourage you to take the sessions in order. That is from session 1 first, going to session 2 next, up to session 6 to maximize your learning. The 12-item post-test and the evaluation form will be released by 11 a.m. today, February 5, 2022. This will be sent via email and through the LMS. Lastly, for any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to send a message to the official Facebook community page, Assessment PD Participants Facebook group.
This ends our last synchronous session of Module B. We hope that this has inspired you to integrate your learning into your practice.
Thank you very much.